This is an interesting question, and it's not one I've previously received in my 7 years of doing advocacy around free prescription contraception, so I thought I'd dive in. The person's asking, what does free birth control have to do with women's rights? Now, there's a couple of ways we can take this, so let's just dive right in. Reproductive autonomy is a fundamental right, and we can frame that as generally the ability to decide if and when you get pregnant. And in order to exercise that right, you require certain tools, and some of those tools include prescription contraception, right? So if you want to avoid getting pregnant and you want to be sexually active, then you may want to be using prescription contraception, and that is expensive. And what we know is the cost of prescription contraception falls disproportionately on women and people who get pregnant, and that cost is significant. Like a hormonal IUD can cost as much as $550, implants are $320, the pill are $20, $30, $40 or more dollars a month. Those costs add up, and a certain group of people are paying those costs, and those are predominantly women and people who get pregnant, people who use prescription contraception directly. And there's a problem saying that, hey, you have a right to do something, but we're going to hide the tools that you need to exercise that right behind a paywall. That's a huge problem. It's not a right at that point. It becomes a privilege. And so when we talk about reproductive justice, and we talk about reproductive autonomy, and we talk about contraception, what we're talking about is the ability for people to actually exercise their rights. Saying on paper that someone has a right to reproductive autonomy is all fine and dandy, but if they don't have the tools to exercise that reproductive autonomy, whether it's access to prescription contraception, whether it's access to abortion services, whether it's access to a comprehensive range of sexual and reproductive health services that are delivered in a fair, judgment-free, up-to-date, and comprehensive manner, those are all key aspects to reproductive justice, to reproductive rights, and to women's rights. And this is not the time or place for a detailed historical analysis of the history of contraception and access to contraception, but I will put a pin in the fact that the history of access to contraception is one that is bathed in misogyny and inherently connected to the patriarchy and patriarchal control of women's bodies and women's rights. So these issues are inherently connected. I think a lot of people can put the pieces together and say, the right to reproductive autonomy is a positive right. It's not freedom from, it's freedom to. And if we acknowledge that people have a right to reproductive autonomy, then there's certain obligations that puts on the state. So that would put obligations to create access to abortion services and also access to contraception. When we say people have a right to reproductive autonomy, it means people should have access to the tools they need to exercise reproductive autonomy. And if they can't afford those tools, if they're hidden behind a paywall, then they don't actually have that right. They actually have a privilege because it's only available to people with a certain income. And this comes up a lot in our advocacy when we say that reproductive autonomy is not something that should be hidden behind a paywall, and it's not something that should depend on your income. If you have a right, it's not something that should be dependent upon how much money you have, but rather it should be based on the fundamental fact that you are a human, that has human dignity, and has human rights.